if you're wondering how to live out kingdom justice, here's some of the keys that I've been discovering, and one of which is a really simple, but I think a big idea of living in your convictions and having the strength to pay attention to the things that move you. I think that we live in a time, this is a generation, it's an epoch time in the body of Christ where it's no longer okay for us to simply focus on our personal growth and development and be overly focused as churchgoers with taking classes and getting more and more skilled up. I think at some point for all of us as followers of Jesus, that skilling up has to translate to doing something with the things that are moving us. And for me, convictions is just that. What is moving you? Is there something that your eyes have been open to that matters enough to you that you're like, I need to do something about that? I think oftentimes we live insecure because we're enamored with the gift of God in our midst, like some preacher or some leader, and we end up insecure and lost in our own personal calling, where I believe when I'm devoted to the person of Jesus, I'm grounded in what it is he's called me to, and I can take action with the things that he's highlighting to me. I love that Emerson quote that says, we pay attention more to the inspiration from bards and sages, which is an old school term of heroes, leaders, people that are dynamic people. We pay more attention to the luster and firmament of their ideas than we would the movement or inspiration that comes through our own spirits. We dismiss that inspiration, that light, because it's from ourselves. And I think it's important. You have to stop and you have to take personal stock. What moves me? What's important to me? What is inspiring me? What is it that I'm seeing? I love that scene in the film on Johnny Cash's life, the one that Joaquin Phoenix plays Johnny Cash, and he's in a record studio, in a recording studio, and he plays a really typical gospel song at the time, and the producer is like, sorry, I don't have time for this, to Mr. Cash and to Johnny Cash. And Johnny Cash says to him, he says, what is it? Is it the song I'm singing or the way I'm singing it? And the executive who ends up becoming Johnny Cash's producer says, both. I don't believe you. And Johnny Cash says, what do you mean? And the guy goes back to say, he finishes with, you mean if you were out there dying in that gutter and you had one last breath, one last song to sing, one last message before you were dirt to tell the world about your time on earth, that you would sing that same outworn song, that same song that everybody knows. And he says, I'm telling you, that's not going to work. He says, the kind of song that sells is a song that you believe. It's a song that means something to you. It's new. It's real. And then he says, that's the kind of song that will save somebody. We were interviewing a guy, he is a survivor in some of the atrocities that have been happening in the Congo for years now. At this point, we were interviewing him in one of the classes that we run in our school ministry. And at this point in the journey, he was actually a human rights advocate in Norway. So we're interviewing him over Skype. And we asked him, hey, like our students they're interested. How do I change the world? And he didn't even skip a beat. I mean, he didn't even pause. He said, believe in what you're doing. You want to change the world? Believe in what you're doing. So how do we get into the space where we believe in what we're doing? I think believing in what we're doing is paying attention to what moves us. It's stopping and allowing ourselves to feel what God feels. If there's an injustice, if there's something happening in culture, if there's some issue that you're like, that can't continue, that can't persist, do you stop and actually let that thing get on you? I love what the Bible talks about in Hebrews 11 about these people that were still living by faith when they died. It says that they had seen a promise. They'd seen a promise from a far off distance and they had welcomed that promise. And you know that word welcomed actually means interview. They had an interview with that promise. So they hung out with that thing that was moving them. Abram, the Lord comes to Abram in a vision. This is Genesis 15. That word vision is actually gazing in the desert. Impregnation by gazing in the desert is the way that Hebrew word can be transliterated out. So I think like taking time with the things that move us matters. And don't explain away what you're seeing. Don't say things like, well, it's just me, it doesn't matter. No, stop, brood, hover over that stuff. Like let that thing start to move in you. And I think when you recognize what's moving you and you start to possess something that matters to you, you're going to have to take a step. Like you're going to have to make a step. I think before I even talk about taking that step, I want to say this one really important thing, and that is pay attention to your journey. So oftentimes we pay attention to other people's journeys. We want to do what other people are doing, but what's happened in your life? Like, is there something significant and unique to your journey? I love the story of St. Patrick, who obviously is this massive figure in Christian history, church history, just like an absolute revivalist, reformationist. Like he changed the island of Ireland, right, with his preaching of the gospel and the way he planted churches. But it's interesting, part of his story was connected to a major injustice that he had suffered. Like he was actually enslaved by these Celtish Druid people that came onto England and literally kidnapped him and forced him into labor trafficking. But in that whole season of his story, there was something forming in his spirit of a burden for those Celtic people, a burden for those Druid people. Like he actually started to form an affinity for their culture. He started to fall in love with the way they went about their business. As he was shepherding in fields, he was a shepherd in a form of being labor trafficked. He was a shepherd, but actually in that space of shepherding is where he met the Lord and actually was born again. But he started to understand nuance of their culture. He started to see their spirituality. And when he ultimately was set free from slavery, the Lord called him to go back to that place and essentially be an apostle to that country, plant churches, lead people to Christ. But everything that was so hard about his journey became a huge point of authority for him in what it was God had called him to. So what is it about your personal story that you need to pay attention to and you need to own and say, hey, this is important? For me, I grew up without my father in the picture directly. He wasn't extremely invested in my journey. He wasn't around. He wasn't available. Don't have a strong relationship with my dad. That became a major point of calling for me in working with youth, that are at risk, in working with kids that are fatherless. It's been a huge part of my journey. I've naturally been drawn to kids in a kind of a mentoring context. So pay attention to your story. But at some point, there's going to have to be a commitment and a decision to say, I am going to do something with what it is I'm being moved in. I love this quote from Teddy Theodore Roosevelt. There's nothing brilliant or outstanding in my record except this one thing. I do the thing that I believe ought to be done. And when I make up my mind to do a thing, I act. I mean, it's important. Like I can sit with ideas, I can be moved in passion, I can think about all the latest, greatest education and tooling up I need. But at the end of the day, yeah, I want to be more educated. Yeah, I want to learn. I want to make a difference in a way that actually helps. But at the end of the day, I'm going to have to make some decisions. I'm going to have to make choices to cross the line, to do things that may feel very risky, where there may be a lot of unknowns involved. Again, referring back to that Abram vision in Genesis 15, Abram believed God, and God credited it to him as righteousness. So God gave him a promise. The promise was connected to his own lack. I don't have kids. How can I have an inheritance and a lineage? God said, no, you're going to have more kids than the number of stars up in the heavens. And it says this about Abram and God's exchange, that Abram believed God. There are moments when we're stirred. There are moments when there are things that matter to us. At the end of the day, these things are in God's hands. And we just have to say yes to him. And in saying yes to him, he credits that to us as righteousness. And he will show up on our behalf. So convictions are so important in terms of engaging in things that are biblical justice. What moves you? What have you seen? What's your story? What's your journey? And in those things that move you, in those things that connect with your journey, make a decision to step out of the boat, to make a decision to commit to making a difference and start showing up.